Today's Antonins program is co-sponsored by Fordham Law School's Institute on Religion, Law, and Lawyers' Work. And if you are a lawyer, you're eligible to get CLE credit for being here today. And to introduce the program, we have Professor Cheryl Bader, who is a clinical associate professor of law. Thank you.
Thank you. It's actually a thrill to be here with Professor Browning to hear about all of his prolific work and scholarship. And when I was sort of thinking about, this lecture really combines, two topics that are really, sort of dear to my heart. One is Holocaust studies, and really trying to sort of make sense and understand, more about the Holocaust, and the other is eyewitness testimony. And I'm teaching at Fordham, but before that, I was a federal prosecutor for a certain period of time. And when I would try a case, often my cases involved a lot of documents and, white-collar portrayal. And I often thought to myself, I really want sort of an eyewitness account for the trial, because even if a document or paper trail can establish the crime, there's nothing like having a narrative, a witness who can put things in context, the drama, the story. And studies show that our brains absorb things that are stories much more easily than compartmentalized pieces of information. And so even though there was a growing literature around and social science research around sort of the lack of reliability of eyewitness testimony, I always wanted sort of to have that witness. And some of you may or may not be familiar with some of the research, but jurors still would always value, and we always place a real value on eyewitness testimony, even though, we'll often know that two people can experience the same thing, the same event, and be telling the truth and be very, authentic in what they're telling, but they've experienced the same event very differently. And also we know that our memories are very fluid, they're dynamic, right? They change. In fact, we think of memories as like sort of a photograph you might pull out of your album or now your iPhone, and it's sort of, there. But actually memories, change and develop over time. And actually the more you retrieve them, the more they actually change. And so despite, though, this social science research, right, we often look to eyewitness testimony. And that's not because, right, it's not valuable, right? It's quite valuable and tells, sort of the human story, the essence of that human experience that we value so much, the explanatory power of that. And so, one question to ask, as a lawyer or non-lawyer is, what is the purpose of, eyewitness testimony? Is it really to sort of create some very accurate depiction of what happened, or is there more sort of a subjective human experience that we're trying to gather from that? And so I will sort of, leave you with that, that thought, and again, very excited to hear about, what insights Professor Browning has on that and otherwise. And so I will introduce him. And so Professor Christopher Browning received his bachelor's degree at Oberlin College and his doctorate degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he taught at Pacific Lutheran University as well as the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was also elected as fellow to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And as I said, he's a prolific scholar in Holocaust studies. And it would take too long to mention all of his scholarship and works. I will mention just a few of the books that he's written. In 1992, Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101, and The Final Solution in Poland, which detailed this police battalion in Poland that were otherwise ordinary citizens who ended up being quite willing assassins and executioners. And the conclusions in those books of how that can happen to sort of, people that were ordinary citizens was actually influenced the research for anyone who was, remembers their sort of Psych 101, the Milgram experiments, right, which showed that sort of ordinary people that participated in this experiment were willing to shock, other, Confederates in the experiment. And so it's really, his research that led to that. In 2004, he wrote The Origins of the Final Solution, the evolution of the Nazi Jewish police. And then in 2010, Remembering Survival Inside a Nazi Slave Labor Camp, for which he earned the 2011 Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. And with that, I will introduce Christopher Brown.
Might catch everything? Good. First of all, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to the Museum of Jewish History for inviting me to speak today, both this afternoon and in fact also again this evening. They wanted to ask me to talk about issues of eyewitness testimony and evidence, and so this afternoon we'll be looking at survivor testimony, this evening at a classic case of perpetrator testimony, namely all of the post-war accounts of Adolf Eichmann, both before capture in Argentina and his voluminous Jerusalem testimonies after his capture in 1960. The focus I want to work on today comes from my book, Remembering Survival, which was a case study of the Jewish community of Wierzbnik, a small Jewish town adjacent to the Polish industrial town of Starachowice, and eventually the complex of factory slave labor camps to which many of the Jews of Wierzbnik, insofar as they were not sent to Treblinka, were allowed to live, but lived as slaves of the German factory owners. In any case, I came to this topic above all because I read a particular judgment in a German court trial, which was so appalling that I simply couldn't not look into the whole issue further. The trial related to a man named Walter Becker. Walter Becker was the police captain in the town of Starachowice. He was put on trial in Germany in late 1971. In February of '72, after a fairly long trial spaced out because of his old age, he was 77 then, that he finally faced the verdict of the court in late February of 1972. Becker was on trial because as chief of police in that town, he had presided over the ghetto clearing, which had sent 4,000 people to Treblinka without a single survivor, and had sent some 1,600 Jews to the camps, of which in the end about 600 or 700 survived. The result was that there, in this case, unlike so many trials in Germany, where it was so hard to find even a handful of witnesses, this was a rare trial where the court was overfilled with witnesses, and that there was no shortage of people whom the prosecution could find and come to testify against Walter Becker. I said a little bit about the background of Walter Becker. He had been a soldier in World War I, survived all 4 years of the war, and then had gone into the German police. In 1930, he joined the SPD, that's the German Social Democrat Party, on the left side of the spectrum. As a result, in 1933, he was suspended, lost his job, but apparently very quickly made his peace with the Nazis, joined the Nazi Party, was reinstalled in his career as a policeman. But all of his subsequent attempts to join the SS were rejected. He was certainly not at the cutting edge of what the Nazis considered an ideal SS man. So, the result being was that he was sent in 1940 in the occupation of Poland to a relatively small back town, a small industrial town of Starachowice, where he remained for the entire war without promotion, without being sent on to a bigger and better task. By Nazi standards, this is a failed career. This is a total non-entity that didn't make it by Nazi career standards. In the town of Starachowice and the adjacent Jewish town of Wierzbik, of course, he was the master of life and death. And as I say, the man who sent some 4,000 Jews to their death at Treblinka. And as was the standard procedure in the district of Radom in central Poland, where this town was located, the itinerant ghetto clearing squads would be sent out by the head of the SS and police in Radom, but in each individual town, the local police chief would be put in charge of the actual operations because he knew the local territory. And so there was no shortage of witnesses to testify that on that day, October 27, 1942, that it was Becker who commanded the squad of auxiliary police, Ukrainians and Latvians, as well as Germans, that descended upon the town, rounded up all the Jews, carried out the selection, sending some 1,600 to labor and 4,000 to the train that would carry them to Treblinka, with numerous testimonies that he had shot people, he had beaten people, and above all, that he was in command and giving the orders as to how the roundup and deportation would be conducted. But nonetheless, at the end of this trial, Judge Erhardt delivered his verdict, in which he began by stating of all the kinds of evidence the law has to deal with: material forensic evidence, documentary evidence, circumstantial evidence, eyewitness testimony. Of all of these, eyewitness testimony was the weakest and least reliable. He then went on to say, in his opinion, eyewitness testimony to be reliable in a court must be, and these are his words, disinterested, indifferent, attentive, intelligent, distanced. Well, survivors who had seen their families murdered met none of those qualifications, and the judge concluded that all the witnesses who had come there, all the survivor witnesses, were, quote, bad witnesses. He then went on to disparage different categories of witnesses. If you had been a young person then, or middle-aged now, you might be an adult now, or you were too young then to understand what was going on. If you were an elderly witness, you might have understood what was going on then, but by now you were too old and your memory was too frail, so you couldn't be trusted either. And a whole series of these very specious, very clever gymnastics he engaged in to not only dismiss survivor testimony in total, but in all sorts of categories, and then engaged also in disparaging individual witnesses on various counts as well. And at the end, then said, given that there is no reliable testimony to contradict the account of Walter Becker, let's keep in mind what his account was. This is the police captain of the town, who said he went to the ghetto that day to pick up 2 Jews to his cleaning women for his apartment, saw the ghetto clearing in operation, which he knew nothing about, watched for 10 minutes, and then went fishing. Now, I've seen many appallingly bad alibi stories, but this is one of the feeblest ways in which somebody has tried to explain why they were not guilty of what dozens of people said they were. But nonetheless, the judge, in total shamelessness, said, given that there was no reliable testimony to contradict Becker's story, the law demanded that he be given the benefit of the doubt, and therefore he was innocent, and left the court and continued to collect his police pension. As I say, this was one of the most appalling verdicts in terms of German courts trying German Nazi suspects that I'd ever encountered. My first reaction was anger. I will get back to this when I can, and if the judge can't put Becker in jail, I'll put him in historians in hell. He'll at least be between the covers of 2 books on the library shelf while everybody for eternity will know what he did. Fortunately for me, it took a long time before I could return to the topic because I had so many other prior obligations. When I did finally get back to it, several things had happened. One was that the collection of possible testimonies had mushroomed because of the opening of the Holocaust Museum in DC, the Visual History Archive project. It turned out by waiting, I doubled the number of possible testimonies I had to work with. But also I had cooled off. I was no longer writing in anger. In fact, anger is not the best motive for historians to operate from. And when I did return to the project, two things interested me much more than evening scores with Walter Becker. One was the subject of the factory slave labor camps themselves. This was a lacuna in Holocaust studies. We had studies of the major ghettos like Warsaw and Łódź. We had studies of major camps like Auschwitz or Majdanek or Dachau. But the privately owned factory slave labor camp, the free enterprise Holocaust, the private enterprise process of exploiting Jewish slave labor at a very high mortality rate, generally had received very little attention. We now know, with the Holocaust Museum in DC having engaged in a project of trying to create multiple encyclopedias of Nazi sites of internment, of what the extent of this was. They started out not having any idea what to work with, but a long card file. And in the end, they in fact, combining concentration camps, prisoners of war camps, ghettos, factory slave labor camps, and other such things, ultimately reached the staggering figure of 42,000 Nazi sites of internment. Of those, 30,000 are factory slave labor camps. They're private camps owned by German businessmen, and corporations, which basically rented their Jewish slave labor from the SS and used this labor to, of course, make their own profits. So this was a huge component, in fact, of the Holocaust that we had known and studied very little. So studying the stark reeks of factory slave labor camps was going to be one major focus. The second was, how does an historian use eyewitness testimony in the lack of documents to write respectable, professionally acceptable history? Most of what had been written about the Holocaust up until then had been based upon captured German documents and the fragments of surviving Jewish documents. Jewish diaries that had been recovered, ghetto administration documents that somehow had been preserved. But generally our approach was documentary. And that the frailty of human memory in terms of post-war testimonies meant that historians much preferred to work in those topics where there was a surviving documentary base, and to shy away from topics in which we didn't have documents, and all we could rely upon was the post-war memories, increasingly distant, of those few who had survived. So this was going to be, in a sense, an experiment in how I could use basically no other source other than a collection of survivor testimonies to try to reconstruct the history of the Starachowice factory slave labor camps, and of course, indirectly, Walter Becker's role in that. In the course of this, I had to collect as many survivor testimonies as I could, and what was astonishing is how that number grew. By the end, I had 292 different people who had given one or more testimonies by the time I began writing the book in 2004, 2005. So this was a very large, unusually large number of survivors, and an unusually large number of them who had decided at some point to give one or more testimonies. These testimonies came in many different formats, and the different formats are important because the way in which a testimony is given shapes in no small part what is said, what the focus is, and so it is important that I go through, in effect, the groups of testimonies that I had to work with. The first of these are what we call early testimonies. And insofar as historians rank these things, many of them want to use these very early testimonies given between 1945 and 1948, when people were fresh out of the camps, their memories are very fresh, the details are very vivid, and the kinds of testimonies people could give then, when these events were so recently in the past, take on a special quality. Now for me, I had 11 early testimonies given between 45 and 48. In fact, a number of them were quite perfunctory. Basically nothing more than a prisoner who'd been being questioned by the Jewish Historical Institute in Poland, where most of these were, would give their itinerary. Well, I was in this camp, I went to this camp, I went to this camp, and they simply relate what their itinerary was through the Holocaust years, and nothing more. For me, fortunately, there were 3 testimonies of great detail, the ideal kind of early testimonies where, as I said, the memories are very vivid. One was even 30 pages, and he didn't finish the story. It took so long, he was dictating it, and he was supposed to come back later. They cut the testimony off, but very sadly, he never resumed it, and in a sense, even my most detailed testimony is an incomplete one in which the end of the story is left untold. So there's no doubt that these detailed early testimonies are very valuable, but they're also very rare. Numerically, they will be a very small percentage of what we have to work with. Then there was a long period of silence, 1948 to 1961 or so, virtually nothing at all. Then the Germans opened their investigation of the Starachowice, the labor camps, and including Walter Becker, people who might have been involved. They interviewed survivors from all around the world. So they sent investigators out, first to Israel, then to the other major places to which survivors from this region had gone, Canada above all, but also the United States, and even off to Australia and some other areas too. I had 125 judicial interviews. And these were very valuable because they were interviews given with a particular focus. These were not historians trying to find out what was the total story, the whole story of Jewish life in the Erechnik and the course of the Holocaust. They were focused on collecting evidence for trial. And these trials required that the evidence be useful to meet the requirements of German law. By 1960-61, the only 2 crimes in Germany related to the Holocaust that had not already passed the statute of limitations were murder and accessory to murder. Something killing like manslaughter, but didn't qualify for the German term of murder, was, by the way, deprivation of freedom, that was enslaving people, was no longer a prosecutable crime. And in Germany, to qualify as murder, and in American terms we'd use the term first-degree murder here, because that was the only thing still that they could be prosecuted for. Murder in Germany was defined judicially as the taking of a human life under certain conditions, with certain motives. And this could be either doing it out of a base motive, and they said anti-Semitism, race hatred qualified there, or to be done with gratuitous cruelty and maliciousness, or to be done with deception and other aggravating factors that would aggravate the suffering of the victim. So that basically for the prosecutors, they not only had to have sufficient detailed evidence that somebody had killed somebody, but that the way in which they had done it would provide persuasive, compelling evidence to a German court that it was done out of hatred, that it was done in a cruel or malicious manner, so that, as the German term was, that this person was an excess killer. That is, they had done more than just kill according to routine and orders, which would have been manslaughter, but in fact met the requirement of murder, that there was their own personal element had been added to the killing. It wasn't a routine doing their job. And so this required the interrogators, the interviewers, to ask in great detail about everything the survivors remembered about particular Germans. As I would later discover when I went through all of the other testimonies, when survivors were telling their own story in the way they wished to, they almost never mentioned Germans by name. They're telling the story of their family. They're telling the story of their community. And incidentally, Germans will get mentioned, but there is, in fact, very little about the perpetrators. So to have a collection of 125 testimonies in which survivor memories are being jogged and pushed to recall as much as they can in the most specific detail they can about the perpetrators, who they were, and not only what they did, but the way in which they did it. That was going to be extraordinarily valuable for me, because this was a dimension that would not be there in any of the other collections of testimonies. Then there was a period again of silence. And it isn't until the early 80s that you begin to get these projects of filming survivors to switch from dictation and writing down what the survivor was saying to actually filming the survivor in person, so that we actually see what and how the survivor is speaking. Begin in the early 80s with the Fortunoff Archive project out of Yale. That was the first of these, and then starting in the early 90s, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and then of course after Schindler's List, the Spielberg-inspired project, the Visual History Archive, now located on the campus of University of Southern California, which would be the largest of these. In fact, these video testimonies came in two styles. How one conducts a video interview can vary. And the Fortunoff Archive and the Holocaust Museum basically gave what I call free-form testimonies. That is, the interviewer will introduce the survivor, and then the camera shifts to the survivor, and the survivor tells their story in any way he or she chooses, in what order he or she chooses, without being interrupted, without being questioned. They are allowed to give a free-form testimony and tell the story as it occurs to them and as they desire to. This often means they get mixed up chronologically, they jump around, it can be very hard to follow. It often means they'll forget certain blocks of stuff that they never get back to. But it also means that they can digress and they can get into difficult topics by coming around in a way that they can't deal with frontally and openly, and deal with some topics that a interviewer structuring the interview wouldn't know that something important was coming and would shut off. So we had the free-form testimonies, and then the Visual History Archive did just the opposite. They had highly structured testimonies with an interventionist interviewer. The notion was that these testimonies should capture the whole life story, so the survivor is not just left to tell his or her story about the Holocaust, but is supposed to spend 20 to 25% of the time on the pre-war period, 50% of the time on the Holocaust itself, and 20 to 25% of the time on the post-war period. So you get a whole life history, pre-Holocaust, Holocaust, and what happened later. And depending upon which country they came from and what experiences they had, if all people from certain camps or from certain countries were supposed to be asked a standard set of questions. The notion would be that you were collecting a database in which, if you wanted to know about religious life in Auschwitz, every survivor of Auschwitz would be asked about, did they participate in religious practices, what was their experience in terms of keeping up Jewish religious observance, and so forth. And a set of these questions that were basically imposed for whatever category the survivor is put in to create a kind of common database. Now, what this meant was a kind of mixed bag. On the one hand, you had a large number of interviewers very quickly trained in a couple of day crash course, and this is how you do an interview, that were relatively clueless. When the survivor is giving the story, they would intervene and say, "Oh, you're getting off track," and try to keep them disciplined. And so many survivors became very, very impatient that this person is kind of riding herd on them. And often, in fact, intervening in very, very disruptive and ultimately destructive ways. On the other hand, there were survivors that simply weren't capable of telling their story, that are brought through it by the interviewer, and we wouldn't have had the testimony except for the fact that there was an interviewer who knew what they wanted to accomplish and to bring them along. Let me give you two examples of two extremes of a very positive outcome and a very negative outcome. The positive outcome, there was a survivor who had escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto, a harrowing story of getting out of the Warsaw Ghetto. Gets to south central Poland, gets into the Starachowice camp. labor camps were havens. This is where people tried to go because they were safer than being on the outside. And then immediately moves to the point that the camp is being evacuated and is going to be sent to Birkenau. And the interviewer says, wait, what happened in Starachowice? 9 months. Oh, and then he talks for 40 minutes. Now, if he'd been left to his own way of telling the story, this was the downtime, the calm between the storms, and the story would have been left out entirely. That was a positive. Now, the negative was one in which a survivor was telling a story and says at this point, a cop will beat you. And the interviewer looked at the survivor and says, you mean you were hit by another Jew? And the cluelessness of the questioner, you could just see the blood drain out of the face of the survivor. Who is this idiot talking to me about this? And he just shut down. End of interview. A few formulaic answers, and the interview was done. Totally destroyed the interview. So there were both positives and negatives that come out of having a structured interview, and it does depend so much on the skill of the interviewer knowing when to let the survivor go and know when it is useful and helpful to intervene. But many people thought they were the star of the story, not the survivor, and that's when things usually went bad. The last category I had were personal interviews. I did 15. 14 of them, for me, I had the great advantage that I'd already read one or more of their testimonies, so that I could, in fact, have a list of my concerns, things that I knew they had a vantage point on that I wanted them to explore much more deeply than they had in their interview. So I would be prepared and ready, wanting to tailor each of these very specifically to the person who I was dealing with. I also had reached the conclusion by then, having seen all of these other interviews, that I wanted this to be as conversational as possible, and that while I would be part of it, to be as unobtrusive as possible. So my rule was sort of that we would start, and almost invariably they would begin by saying, what do you want to know? And I would say, anything you want to tell me that you think is important. And so I would let them start and talk the way they tell the story as they wished. And two things thereafter. One, whenever we broached and got towards some area that I really wanted to go into detail, I would throw in a question, well, tell me a little bit more about that. And then direct and explore, but not as a kind of inquisition, but simply an encouragement to go into depth in an area where I knew they knew things that they hadn't fully gone into that were valuable to me and that they could help. The second was fairly early in the interview. I would ask a question in which I would show them how much I already knew. I remember one survivor I was speaking with, she mentioned one commandant. I said, well, what about Kolditz, which is the cousin company? And I don't think anybody has said this name to her in 50 years. And her jaw dropped. You know Kolditz? Well, suddenly the whole interview is on an utterly different level. Now she knows that she can refer to all sorts of things without having to explain them. And the conversation can now go on at a depth and a detail that she hadn't been able to talk about in years, because she would be telling it to people without background. And now she knew we were going to have a conversation of a very different kind. Result was, when I got done, when I started the interviews, I thought, well, this would be kind of the frosting on the cake. This would be very useful to layer on the rest. When I wrote the book and I look at my footnotes, I see that the 15 personal interviews are so disproportionately important that they take up so much more in terms of information that I'm constantly referred to and cited in comparison to the total of 292 people in the multiple interviews that many of them gained. So that was a surprise. I didn't know that personal interviews were going to be so central, and it turned out that they were just absolutely crucial to the whole enterprise. In terms of what comes out of, in a sense, the historian's relationship to survivor testimony has been a delicate topic. For some, the survivor, in a sense, is, I wasn't there, the survivor was. Who am I to subject the survivor to questioning? Who am I to analyze in a cold-blooded historical manner their testimony. One should basically, listen in awe and accept what a survivor says. And those who have done this, the results have been disastrous. Let me just remind us of two things. In the early 1980s, the Office of Special Investigations was trying to find information about Ivan Demjanjuk as a man who had a Travniki card. We knew he was a member of the Ukrainian auxiliaries recruited to be from that group from which death camp guards and ghetto clearing squads were recruited. In showing a photo spread for another case related to Treblinka, so the Treblinka survivor said, here's so-and-so from Treblinka, and oh, there's Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. And they pointed out Ivan Demjanjuk. Now the problem was, of course, after one or two thought they had seen him, word among survivors spreads very quickly, and it is very likely that subsequent ones had a power of suggestion that Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka is out there, and whatever. I don't know all the mechanisms. I know there were subsequent questions raised about the procedural errors that the OSI made in the creation of their photo spread and how it was presented to survivors. But the result was 5 Treblinka survivors were sure that Ivan Demjanjuk was Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. And so he was denaturalized here and extradited to Israel, tried and convicted. During his appeals period is when glasnost came and we could get into Soviet archives, got into KGB records, which very quickly could locate testimonies of his comrades in his same cohort, and that the ID card, which said he had been transferred to Sobibor, not to Treblinka, in fact was true, and that he was Ivan the less terrible of Sobibor, not Ivan the Terrible of Treblinka. And the Israeli Supreme Court very courageously had to overturn the verdict. This would have been a mistaken identity. Sent him back to the US, where years more passed, and then he is denaturalized once again as Ivan the less terrible of Sobibor, sent to Germany, where he was tried, convicted, and then died in a prison hospital in Germany just very recently. Another one is the Wilkomirski alleged memoir fragments. Benjamin Wilkomirski wrote about having been a 4 or 5-year-old in the concentration camp system. He was lionized, brought to the Holocaust Museum and feted, and this was praised up and down when my colleague Ralph Hilbert, the Holocaust historian, who had warned the OSI that they should trust the ID card, and they had a man from Sobibor, looked at fragments and said, well, that's a fine novel, but it's not a memoir. And indeed, an enterprising Swiss journalist then discovered that Wilkomirski had been born in Switzerland after the war. This is a total fabrication. Now, he probably did it sincerely. I mean, I think he's invented himself into a false story that he may actually believe, but that's a psychological problem of his, but it isn't a case of one thing we do know is what's in that book has nothing to do with being the actual memoirs of a Holocaust survivor. So if one does not apply normal historical critical method to survivor testimony, the results are likely to be terribly damaging to Holocaust scholarship. You're not doing study of the Holocaust any favor by giving survivor testimony a pass and not subjecting it to the same kinds of examination of evidence that we would do with any other kind of evidence. Another issue is that people say, well, survivor testimony is important because it's authentic and we don't have to worry about it being accurate. And indeed, many people who write history, they'll write based on the documents, and then as a kind of sidebar, as a kind of illustrative, experiential element, they will bring in the survivor testimony that illustrates the impact of what they've just looked at. And so it will be used as a kind of instrument of authenticity, to convey authenticity. And that's not wrong, but that's not the the problem I faced when the only evidence I had was eyewitness testimony of survivors, and I had to deal with issues of accuracy as well. It had to be not only authentic, it had to be accurate. I had to decide which were the accurate memories, which were the accurate testimonies, which could I trust my reputation as a professional historian in using to recreate the history of the Starachowice factory and slave labor camps. Now, when I started the project, I had a certain expectation. I had thought, because most of the survivors went to one of three places, either Israel, mostly around Haifa, or to Canada, mostly around Toronto, or to the United States, mostly in Boston, New York, but actually spread more widely there. And I thought that over time, two things would happen. That as the survivors in each of these communities talked to one another, they would develop a more homogeneous communal memory from their area, but these communal memories would increasingly diverge over time. So that we would have a Haifa communal memory, and with differences between memories there erased, but it becoming increasingly different from the homogenized Toronto memory and so forth. And I thought that over time, sensitive issues would disappear. It would become a increasingly kind of black and white narrative without subtleties, without issues of nuance, as the story got kind of flattened out into a morality tale. I was wrong. One of the most pleasant surprises of the project was coming to the conclusion that survivor testimony was much more stable. It didn't diverge between different survivor communities over time. What I would call, what I finally settled on the term, is called the core memory. The core memory about what happened there in the Israeli community, the Toronto community, the American survivor community, was basically the same, and it remained the same over decades. Clearly, different people have individual experiences they remember as their own or different from one another, but the core memory, the basic story, was solid, stable, and that then gave me a baseline. It was once I had the core memory, I had something against which I could make judgments about stories that only one person had. Did it fit into that? Was it part and plausible in relation to what I knew more generally from the mass of other testimonies? So having a core memory that I could rely upon was important in terms of then dealing with all the outlier stories and all of the incidences in which you have only one witness. And you can't corroborate, and you have to decide, in a sense, is this a story that's believable and plausible and probable, or is it best not to include it? So the relative stability was I think, important to me. Secondly, I found, in fact, as people approached old age, they could talk about very sensitive topics for the first time. I was getting stories after 1989 that people wouldn't talk about in the first decades. And let me give you two key examples. One, for women, the ability to talk about sexual violence really does not start until 1989, 1990. It's still problematic because, of course, in the largest number of testimonies, that of the Visual History Archive, the woman is being filmed in her home, and at the end, she's going to be surrounded by her grandchildren, and it is clear the tape is going to become not only a possession of the archive, but it's become the family possession, the story of the family. This is not a conducive format to talk about sexual violence. And so on the tapes, they don't. But people whose tapes I heard and then could talk to in a personal interview could add that dimension. And so what you got hints of in the tape, you could then, again, get much more on a one-to-one level, even though I was a male, and I think if I had been a female interviewer, I probably would have heard much more than I did. I could get accounts now that dealt with sexual violence that had not been there before. So that was one area where a sensitive topic comes on only late. The second one was revenge killing. Now, Starachowice was a camp system in which, as many survivors said, of all the camps they went through in the war period, this was the most inegalitarian camp culture they experienced anywhere. Each camp had its own particular footprint, had its own camp culture that would depend a great deal upon who the camp leaders were, and in particular who the privileged Jews appointed by the Germans to run the camp were and how they ran it. And in Starachowice, there was a small clique. At the top was a man named Jeremiah Vilcek, and his family and his friends basically ran the kitchen, were the barracks elders, and ran the camp police. And so all power was in their hands. If you needed to be transferred from one job to another, you had to bribe them. You needed medicine, you had to bribe them. You needed extra rations for somebody who was sick, you had to bribe them. Everything was for sale, everything had a price, and they had a stranglehold on the governance of the camp. And they were hated. Above all, they were hated by a group of prisoners who came in at the very end. Fordham is in central Poland. To the east of that is the province of Lublin. Lublin is where the Operation Reinhardt camps were, where Majdanek is. And it's where the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto were sent first to the Poniatowa and Travniki labor camps, and some of them on to Majdanek. When they are evacuating Lublin district, the teeny remnant of a remnant of a remnant of survivors, these are people who survived Warsaw, survived liquidation of labor camps, survived every imaginable thing. It's a miracle they were alive. Some of those, when they're evacuated as the Soviets approach in the spring of '44, are sent to Starachowice. There they are treated as last in, bottom of the hierarchy. This is a very hierarchical camp. And so that of all the people who hated Vilcek, they hated him the most. Well, when the camp is evacuated in late July of '44, people are put on the train to take them to Birkenau. The camp elite, the Prominenten, as they were called, were put in the first car. And at the last minute, people from this Lublin group slipped into the front car. On the way to Birkenau, fights broke out, and Vilcek, his son, the camp cook, and their coterie are either strangled or beaten or stamped to death in the train car on the way to Birkenau. When they arrive in Birkenau, and of course everybody's going to get out of the train on the ramp and march forward, first car first, the bodies of these people are laying there. I mean, everybody in this camp knew what had happened. But it was not a topic anybody wanted to talk about until much, much later. But they do talk about it finally starting in the 1990s. So these are sensitive topics that wouldn't come in until much later. Now, as I went through this, I certainly realized that you know, an event and the memory of an event are a very different thing. But in fact, there isn't even just a memory of an event. There are layers of memory. And I want to talk a little bit now about what I consider the layers of memory and what an historian working with this has to deal with. The first is a layer that we simply don't know. And this is a layer I call repressed memory. These are things that were so horrific, so terrible, so traumatic, that even the survivor no longer knows what happened to them or what they may have done, what they may have experienced. Now, obviously, survivors can't tell me their repressed memories. I've come to this because of an experience not of a Holocaust survivor, but of my uncle. He was a missionary in Singapore in 1942. And as the Japanese came down the Malay Peninsula, he put his wife and one-year-old child on one of the last boats across the Indian Ocean, but decided himself to stay because in his own mind at that time, he couldn't be a Christian pastor leading his flock and not sharing their faith and ever come back to them and become a pastor. Again, he had to stay and share what they were going to experience. So he decided to stay when he could have gone. Of course, once the Japanese arrived, most of his parishioners were Singapore Chinese. He's an American, enemy alien. He's immediately interned and is sent to Changi prison on the far coast of Singapore. Barely survives, has half his body weight when they're liberated in the summer of 1945. By that point, he had absolutely no memory that he didn't need to have experienced that. That he could not have survived if every day for 3.5 years he had been beating himself up about why did I do such a stupid thing as not get on the boat with my wife and child. the psychological burden of carrying that, he could not survive. Repression was a defense mechanism that enabled him to survive. How did he recover repressed memory? He went back to his garden and dug up his diary and read it and recovered what had been a repressed memory that he otherwise never would have had. How many survivors experience things that in order to survive, it was necessary that their memories repressed this, and they've never been able to go back to their garden and dig up their diary. They had no way of recovering this. So I'm making an assumption, but I think it's a plausible assumption that given what we know of the level of trauma and the horrific choices and things that people experienced, that some of that had to have been repressed. There are things that survivors experience that they themselves no longer remember and no longer recover. A second level of memory I would call the secret memories. These are memories that survivors have that, again, are so difficult that they will not share them with anybody else. Now, over time, sometimes they become confessional moments. I mean, how many of us have read survivor memoirs or listened to someone and they say, now for the first time I'm saying something I've never told another human being before. And they will have that confessional moment in which they will now reveal something that has just been so unbearable they couldn't, in fact, reveal it up until that point. So we do have ways in which secret memories can come out whenever the carrier of them decides at that point that they finally can speak the unspeakable. So that does come out. There's a third set of memories I call communal memories. Memories that everybody in the community knows. Same camp, same ghetto, they've experienced them, but they also have a tacit understanding that what they have experienced and the circumstances under which they behaved in certain ways are so alien, so foreign to any listener, that the listener couldn't possibly understand and would come to an unfair and false judgment, and it would be an unsocial act to the others in the community to talk about it. Revenge killing is the prime example of that. For years and years, nobody talked about the revenge killing in the car on the way to Birkenau as something that, how do you explain to other Jews that Jews murdered Jews? They didn't wait for the Germans to kill these people in the gas chamber. They killed them on their own on the way to Birkenau. And so this was something that nobody wanted to talk about for a very long time. Needless to say, of course, particularly as the earlier testimonies were testimonies given to German judicial investigators, when you're trying to get Walter Becker convicted of murder, the last thing you want to talk to a German about is how we tromped to death the Prominenten that you were using to control our camp. So the circumstances, certainly, of the 60s testimonies are not conducive. This is not the audience, above all, to whom you want to tell this. So the communal memory of revenge killing does come out, but again, very, very late. And finally, what I would call the public memories. These are the memories that people write in their memoirs, which they speak about when they talk on the tapes. But as we see, public memory grows. As people tell their secrets, as groups decide that something doesn't have to be hidden anymore, secret memories and communal memories become public. And in fact, having delayed my writing of the book, a whole lot more had gone from secret and communal to public by the time I was getting to the late 90s and writing. That not only did I have many more testimonies, but I had testimonies with topics and subjects that I knew a lot more about, could know a lot more about, than if I had tried to write this book in the middle of the 80s when I first came across the topic. The story also has two other kinds of, I wouldn't call them memory deformation, but challenges in how one uses memory. The first of these is what historians call collective memory. And that is over a period of time, particularly people in a group, as they talk about things, they will erase certain parts of the memory, enhance and emphasize certain other parts of the memory. So the story you have in the 1970s is how you, in the 70s, want things to have been in the 1940s, want things to be remembered, and you've changed the memory over time, sanitized it, tailored it, to suit whatever the needs of the 1970s are, that may not be an accurate reflection of what in fact was the case of the 1940s. In terms of collective memory, I didn't find a real problem there for the war years. That is, I didn't find as I said, I found it fairly stable. I didn't find things being deformed and erased over time. Where I did find a classic evidence of conflicting collective memories was in how survivors talked about the 1930s. Now, Wierzbnik was the town, this Jewish, adjacent town to Starachowice, more than half Jewish, very Jewish town in Poland. North American survivors, their account of Wierzbnik is that it was this very backward, primitive town, no running electricity, very little, even the outhouse in the courtyard, that it was highly religious in its observance, that most of the population spoke Yiddish, and that basically this was a very traditional, conservative, old-fashioned, not quite fiddler on the roof, but getting there. And as many of them said, this was, and they could remember fondly, as some of them said, this was an ideal Jewish existence in Poland. It would have been perfect if only there had been no Poles. And this is also another trope that goes through things. But in any case, they viewed this as what the disappeared Jewish world. This is what Jewish life had been in the pre-World War II, before things, and this is what's disappeared entirely. You go to Israel in the 1970s, where they are now creating the community book and getting people to write various stories about the Wierzbnik community to be published. The Iskor book it was called. And suddenly Wierzbnik appears very differently. Wierzbnik was a beehive of Zionist activity, discussion groups, Maccabi soccer clubs, and they were all getting ready to go to Israel. And they were all, Israelis in being. They weren't passive diaspora Jews, old-fashioned, whatever else. They were practically Israeli sovereigns. And of course, this is what, by the 1970s, they wanted to have remembered about the community. It's a very selective memory of what had been there. So depending upon whether one ended up in Israel or the United States or North America, you had two very different collective memories of the pre-war period. As I say, fortunately, that division does not appear in terms of the war period itself. And there I have a much more reliable core memory. The second kind of interference one can get is what I call incorporated memory. And this is, of course, during the period after the war. We have trials, newspaper coverage, memoirs, Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi. We have documentary movies, World at War and so forth. We've got full feature-length movies, Schindler's List and whatever. And over time, the ability of people to distinguish between what they actually experienced and what they're incorporating into their memories from post-war tropes about the Holocaust that appear in Holocaust popular culture become almost impossible to distinguish. And people incorporate into their own memories things that they didn't, in fact, experience themselves, but they think they must have experienced because that's what everybody experienced. That's simply part of what it meant to be a survivor. Now again, for the period of the Starachowice camps and Wierzbnik ghetto, this is isolated enough and is unknown enough that we don't get any real intrusion. Nobody's making a movie about the Starachowice camps. There's no famous memoirist who's writing about it. It's mentioned in no documentary. So it remains relatively pristine. But when they get on the train from Starachowice to be evacuated to Birkenau, that's when things change. Because there's no more classic trope of the Holocaust than the standard story of your arrival in Birkenau. The train arrives at night, you peer through the cracks in the train car, you see the fire coming out of the chimneys, you come up to the ramp at dawn, the doors are thrown open, the dogs are barking, they're yelling rouse, rouse, you get out on the ramp, you're lined up according to women and children on one side, men on the other, and you march past a SS doctor, boys of course is Mengele, even though there are 24 doctors that had to rotate, and then it's to the left to the gas chamber or right into the camp. And this is a trope because this was the routine. This is what almost everybody going into Auschwitz experienced. But not the Starachowice survivors. Nonetheless, a large minority of them now tell the classic story. And they believe it. And they're very sincere about it. We arrived and we had the selection. They tell the story that any of us can recite because we have seen it repeated so many times in post-war representations, whether it be movies or literature or whatever. Why was Starachowice different, and why do I know that it's different? And as a historian can bet my professional reputation that those who say they didn't have that are right, and those who claimed the normal routine entry are wrong. Starachowice was as I say, already a labor camp, and what I argue is that it was sent to Birkenau, and they are brought into Birkenau as an internal camp transfer. So there's no need for a selection, and they are all sent into the labor camp. And that's what many survivors still testify to, despite the temptations of incorporated memory. That they continue to say, our arrival at Auschwitz was utterly different. We didn't do that. We were sent, fortunately, thank God, we were sent as a group into the camp to quarantine. The quarantine was right next to the gypsy camp. We arrived at the end of July, 1st of August. We remember vividly on August 2nd when the gypsy camp was liquidated. It happened right on the wire next to us because they needed more room to bring in other transfers from central Poland as the Red Army approached. And they have their own story, and it fits exactly what we know to be the chronology of that period. How would anybody, why would more people from the camp come up with a false, atypical story that is internally consistent among themselves than a true believing but smaller group who insist on the trope story, on the standard story? I just don't see any mechanism by which they could. More important, however, is the following. Officially, Starachowice was a labor camp. Unofficially, it had become a family camp. That at the beginning, the Prominenten were allowed to bring in their families and their children. So there are children in the camps at Starachowice. In the initial period, it's a very deadly period. The industrialists who built these camps didn't know how to do it. They were doing it on the cheap. The sanitation is horrible. And there's a terrible typhus epidemic that sweeps through the camp. And for the camp owners who are renting their Jewish slaves on a contractual per head per day basis, if somebody falls sick with typhus, even if they survive, they're going to be totally, acute high temperature for 3 weeks, and even if they survive, the fever breaks. For the next 3 weeks, they're going to be absolutely incapacitated. They're going to be out of the workforce for 6 weeks. But they're still going to be paying per head per day for workers that can't work. They're going to be a profit hemorrhage. And the result was initially that the policy of the corporate owners was to have the camp security force, which is their own private hired guard. There's not SS in this camp. These are the private factory security force running a camp built by the corporation that owns the factory using slave labor. The policy is you find people with typhus, you kill them. Dead Jews, you don't pay for them. Sick Jews, you have to pay for them. And so you have a very high death rate in the camp from the fall of 42 into the spring of 43. And then, at that point, the ghettos of Poland have been liquidated. You have a few remnant ghettos, but most Jews in Poland then are either already in labor camps or they're hiding in the forest, and you can't get new Jewish workers. Well, dead Jews are gone forever. Sick Jews can be healed and put back to work. And suddenly, when Jewish labor becomes irreplaceable, you have a new profit calculation. And so you stop killing sick Jews. You fire the killer commandant to bring in a new commandant. Conditions improve, death rates go way down and stabilize. At that point, many people in the camp who had bought work permits, this is another aspect of campus strength, these people buy their slavery. You buy the work permits that get you into the labor camps. You buy your position as slave because that's the alternative going to bring you. This is fairly unique in world history, people buying themselves into slavery. But in any case, at that point, many who had bought work permits for the husband, for the wife, for the teenage children, couldn't do this for the infant kids. And so they would pay Poles to hide them. It was dangerous because there are all sorts of people out there looking to collect bounties by uncovering hidden Jews. The decision after the death rates drop in the camp is to smuggle their children back into camp. It is safer inside the camp now than to be in hiding on the outside. So the child population grows. When this transport goes into Birkenau, there are many children. And the children know that there was no selection. As they say, the only reason I'm alive today is the greatest miracle of my life is that we went into Birkenau without a selection. And for a historian, for me that concludes something. They're right, that's the conclusive proof. So, what our argument is we have to make critical judgments about survivor testimony. Often we get conflicting testimonies. We have to sort it out. We have to say, I'm going to believe this, I'm not going to believe that. Sometimes it's simply as was mentioned earlier, different people have different vantage points and experience the same event in different ways. And both are telling the truth. It's simply a different event for them. But in many cases, they're incompatible. You cannot reconcile them. And arrival in Auschwitz with or without a selection is one of those things. And historians have to make decisions and to make their calls. In the end, then, I would say, I was very fortunate to have the different kinds of testimony. They each had its own advantages and disadvantages. I don't believe there is a perfect way to conduct a survivor interview or a perfect form of survivor testimony. I was fortunate to have a mix of early and late, of directed and indirect, of personal or film, of dictated, because all of them had advantages I could could make use of, hopefully, and not incorporating the weaknesses and disadvantages. So that's, in a sense, the basis of the project. If you want to know what I actually found out and what happened in this camp, there's a book you can read. So I would say if that intrigues you, do by all means get the book. But today I want to talk about the evidence behind the book. Thank you very much.
That was really fascinating. I looked at I watched quickly just to see how much time had passed, and I can't believe that we're already at 4:10. So I will forego the questions I had because I want to give people a chance to ask a question. I don't know if we have a mic that can be handed out or not, but if not, you can speak loudly. So in the back. Yes.
I have a comment to make regarding your experience and people testifying their own experience after many years. I'm a child of survivor. My parents were survivors. I was born in Germany after the war. And plenty of people were murdered, and plenty of people survived. Nobody talked until they got much older. And when I found when they did talk, they would say, I never told this to anybody before, but it was more because I felt that it was hard for them to verbalize, because they kept saying that over and over to others who talked to them about the same experience. Your experience was that they felt relief, they finally got it off their chest. People that I talked to, family members, it seemed to me they couldn't get over it and they never got it off their chest. They just had to keep saying that they never told anybody before because it was so deep within them. So that's just a comment. I did find your presentation very, very informative and most interesting, and I will purchase your book and read it.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to know, was it pretty much always the case with this very late camps that the Jews work their way in, or was it
Yeah, the question was it standard that Jews bought their slavery, or was this particular to this camp? I think in this particular town, this was much more prevalent. One, because the factories there had been off-bound to Jews before the war. There's only Poles who had the privilege of high-paying jobs in the munitions factory, the steel world. And so they got in only after the Germans took it over, and Poles were being sent to Germany for forced labor, and there was a labor shortage. Even then, for Germans, this was a way of, this was part of German corruption. That they sent trucks out to surrounding villages, you would buy a seat in the truck, and you would pay for your work permit, and then come and dump you in the ghetto, and the next morning you would get marched to the factory. And so for people, particularly as the word spread in 42, that ghettos are being liquidated, the rush to buy work permits is a calculated survival strategy that takes place. And it is certainly part of the ethos of the Germans in that area that this is one of our private moneymakers. And so it became very standard there. I'm sure there are other areas where in fact they simply rounded up, they came in very quickly, rounded people up. And the camps are not in that town. And so people are taken from town and sent to some camp way far away, and there is none of this kind of exchange. But this is a case where the local Germans running the camp had an ideal setup for filling their pockets by selling permits to let Jews work in their factories, knowing that they were desperate to do that. So I would say, I can't answer it for certain, but I would guess it is a much more it is more common and more the typical in this camp than in some other areas.
In the back, the gentleman.
Yes. Is there a good study of the relationship between the SS as suppliers of labor and German corporations who use them for that purpose? It's a fairly gruesome.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the initial study would have been sort of on the SS using labor in its own camps. Then we have some studies, say, of the basically the whole German Fortune 500 went to Auschwitz and built satellite camps. I mean, there's 36 satellite camps around Auschwitz. Buna, being one of these, is basically and then you had other as well. And certainly for factories in Germany getting not Jewish, but Ukrainian or Polish or Russian labor that's being brought back, that's impressed labor that they're begging for. But in terms of this actual contractual relationship between the local SS and Germans who've taken over factories in Poland, this is pretty particular in Poland, and it hasn't been well studied. In part because, one, the corporations are so much better at destroying their written records than German bureaucrats were, that we have very little paper record. Many of these were corporations that didn't have a post-war existence, so they don't have an ongoing corporate life afterward. And so all of those makes it very difficult to write this history. And to say why I could do that, I could not do this from German corporate side. There's simply no paper trail at all. I could do it from Jewish survivor memories, which tell us something else, but it doesn't tell us what actually went on between the heads, the factory managers, and the Radom SS and the higher SS and police.
Just a very quick, do we have any idea of the magnitude of profit that the SS enjoyed from this?
No. We know that they had thousands and thousands of Jewish laborers in Radom alone. So the police we can calculate. Say if you had 15,000 Jewish workers in these munitions factories in the Radom district, and they're getting 5 zloty per day for each Jewish male and 4 zloty per day for each Jewish female, you can multiply it out and see what their daily profit was. They're lining their pockets, and as every other German in the East is doing.
Thank you.
The transfer that you were talking about from private camp to Birkenau, you mentioned that the children went along because there was no selection. What happened afterward, in the intermediate period before liberation?
Yes, the younger children, male and female, went into the female camp with their mothers. The older children would be separated depending upon gender. So if you were a teenage boy and looked older, you went usually with your father. And then from the quarantine camp, employers came and chose people. So even if you're going into that with your father, you might get separated from your father and your brother and taken off on your own. One of the most sort of well, I mean, there are many heartbreaking testimonies, but one was the younger boy. His older brother went with his father. He went with his mother. Regulations in the female camp were much more lax, much less selection, much more stringent selection. In the male camp, the younger boy lived, the older brother did not. He survived, and his older brother doesn't. And that was, for him, a terrible thing that he wrestled with forever. So, how, who survives Auschwitz is one of these things. There's infinite variables, and there's no system. But I would say the Starachowice will go through Auschwitz with relatively low loss of life. One, because there's no selection, and two, because when they come in, the two other groups coming in are either Hungarian Jews, who are totally clueless about camp life. These people have camp experience. They know how to survive in a camp. The Hungarians come in and they're totally clueless. The others that come in are the Jews from Łódź, and they have been much less. They're skeletons. They have no reserve left. They're starved, and people in Starachowice have eaten much better. So they are, in that sense, given the social Darwinian life of the camp, they are positioned to survive better than either the Hungarian or the Łódź Jews. And it's not until the death march, it's not until the evacuation that you begin to get the last decimation of the group. Enough of them are healthy enough that, in fact, they're sent from Birkenau to factories in Germany or Czechoslovakia, even in the fall. They don't even experience the death marches. They're the most fortunate ones, and they're moved out by train and sent to other factories before the closure of the camp and the terrible sequence of winter death marches that follows.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So the woman with the hand, and then over here. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I was wondering, all the people that, in your book, Remembering Survival, as I interviewed some of these people, wondering, did you interview all the people that you highlighted in your book? I'm thinking of a particular survivor, or did you take what from her show or interview pieces and then use it in your research?
No, I interviewed only 15 people. So I had
Clara Sabina Weissman, I don't know, do you remember that? She had an abortion that she paid for at the camp?
I don't think I interviewed her, no.
Okay, so then.
I saw her testimony, though.
Oh, you saw her testimony?
Yeah.
I see. Thank you. The family wants to know. I told them.
Okay, no, I don't believe I did interview her, but I did see her. She had a very important testimony.
She's very important, I'm including that. I'll tell you later when I'm working with Michael Turner, but I'll tell you.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
I'll take one more question up
Yes,
here.
I'm very honored, Doctor, to be in your presence and, to be able to attend this function. Very kindly come. But I wanted to ask if my understanding is correct. Irving was extradited from his home in Ohio to Germany at about age 92.
Ivan Demjanjuk, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, what's his first name?
Ivan Demjanjuk. Yeah, John Demjanjuk.
Not Irving.
No, no, Irving is a different person.
And who's Irving then?
David Irving is a Holocaust denier that sued Deborah Lipstadt for libel and lost a court case in London,
Oh, okay.
for which I was one of the historical witnesses on Deborah's behalf.
Thank you.